Ukraine.
Fans. Ukraine was a Russian beginning to acquit authority, even if the United States is a matter of Ukraine and patriots
But to his family.
Ukrainian.
Ukraine, 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 but Ukraine, Ukraine,
Ukraine's government, Ukrainian, the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government of Ukraine,
Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government,
Ukraine is what?
government of Ukrainian,
Ukrainian,
Ukrainian, government, government,
Ukraine. Talk to them about Ukrainian.
The Ukrainian
Government. Ukrainian.
government,
Ukrainian government,
Ukrainian government.
infinite patience.
This is a big other. It's been now with European monitors. Ukraine government,
Ukrainian government, Ukrainian government of Ukraine,
Ukraine.